Can a mafia boss's heart survive true love? Can a soul forged in shadow and blood find salvation in the light of an innocent gaze? They say in our world, love is a liability, a bullet aimed at your back. But what they never tell you is that sometimes, love is the only thing worth pulling the trigger for. Alara Falcone was meant to be a ghost, a living trophy of her family's defeat, presented to Dante the Shadow King Moretti in the heart of his empire. Her father's blood was barely dry on the cobblestones of the old city, a failed coup that cost him everything, including his daughter. She stood before his mahogany desk, a whisper of defiance in a simple linen dress that was an insult to the room's opulent dread. The air, thick with the scent of aged whiskey and cold steel, clung to her skin. Dante Moretti didn't rise. He watched her from the throne-like leather chair, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, dissecting her piece by piece. He was a masterpiece of lethal grace, sculpted from violence and power, his pinstripe suit a cage for the beast within. His men statues of loyalty and menace lined the walls. "She is yours, Don Moretti," her uncle stammered, his sweat a testament to his terror. A peace offering Dante's lips, a cruel thin line barely moved. "Get out." The room emptied in a heartbeat, leaving only the two of them, a king and his captive, predator and prey. Alara lifted her chin, the last bastion of her pride. "I will not be your pawn." A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips, a flicker of warmth in an Arctic landscape. He rose, circling her like a shark. "Pawn." His voice was a low growl, a rumble of thunder before the storm. "No, mia cara. You misunderstand." He stopped behind her, his breath a ghost on her neck. "You are not a pawn. You are the board. The prize. You are mine." His claim was not a whisper, but a brand, searing itself onto her soul in the suffocating silence of his dominion. The gilded cage was a villa perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, a beautiful prison of marble and glass. Alara was given silk she didn't want, jewels that felt like shackles, and a freedom that ended at the iron gates patrolled by men with guns holstered beneath their tailored jackets. She spent her days exploring the grounds, a ghost haunting the edges of Dante's world. She discovered his secret, a hidden rose garden meticulously tended, a riot of crimson and white blooms defying the sterile perfection of the estate. It was a place of impossible softness in a world of hard edges, a glimpse into the man behind the monster. He found her there one evening, the setting sun bleeding across the sky, casting long shadows that made the thorns look like daggers. He stood at the edge of the garden, watching her trace the velvet petal of a blood-red rose. "They were my mother's," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She didn't startle. She had felt his presence long before he spoke. "They're beautiful," she admitted, her voice quiet. "Beauty is a dangerous thing in our world, Alara. It makes men careless." He stepped closer, the scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something metallic, mingling with the fragrance of the flowers. His cousin and consigliere Marco watched from a distant balcony, his face a mask of pleasantries that didn't quite hide the venom in his eyes. He saw the way Dante looked at her, and a seed of treacherous ambition took root in his cold heart. "Perhaps," Alara countered, meeting Dante's gaze. "It's the only thing that reminds them they're still men." A flicker of something, surprise, intrigue, a long-forgotten pain, crossed his features before the mask of the Shadow King slammed back into place. The tension between them was no longer just fear and power. It was a fragile, terrifying curiosity, a single perfect rose blooming in a field of landmines. The nights were the worst. The villa, so vast and empty, seemed to amplify the silence until it was a scream. One night, a real scream tore through the quiet, a raw guttural sound of agony that pulled Alara from a restless sleep. She followed the noise to Dante's chambers, the heavy oak doors slightly ajar. She peered inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was thrashing in his bed, caught in the throes of a nightmare, his face contorted in a mask of anguish she'd never seen. He was calling a name, Sophia. His voice choked with a grief so profound it was a physical wound. Hesitantly, she slipped into the room. The moonlight streaming through the window painted him in shades of silver and black. He jolted awake, his eyes wild, a sheen of cold sweat on his brow. He saw her, and for a second, the lethal dawn was gone, replaced by a lost, broken man. His hand was bleeding, a fresh cut across his knuckles where he must have struck the wall. Without thinking, Ilara moved to the ensuite, found a cloth and antiseptic, and returned to his side. She said nothing, simply knelt by the bed and began to clean the wound. He flinched at her touch, his muscles coiling, but he didn't pull away. Her fingers were gentle, her movements sure and compassionate. It was an intimacy more profound than any kiss, a quiet act of care in a life devoid of it. He watched her, his breathing evening out, the storm in his eyes receding to a troubled calm. "Who was Sophia?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the distant crash of waves. "My sister," he finally said, the words tasting like ash. "Betrayed. By our own blood." He didn't say more, but he didn't have to. In that shared silence, Ilara saw the deep, festering wound at the core of his soul, the reason he trusted no one. As she finished bandaging his hand, his fingers closed around her wrist, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Thank you," he murmured, his gaze holding hers, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The captor and the captive were gone, leaving only a man and a woman, bound by a moment of shared vulnerability. The power dynamic of Dante's world was a brutalist stage, and the weekly dinner with his capos was its premiere performance. Ilara was seated to his right, a queen in a borrowed kingdom, dressed in emerald silk that made her eyes flash like jewels. The air was thick with cigar smoke, and the low murmur of dangerous men discussing business that was anything but legitimate. Marco sat opposite, his smile a predatory slash, his eyes constantly flicking between Dante and Ilara. A capo from the Docklands, a brutish man named Johnny, emboldened by wine, let his eyes linger on Ilara for too long. "A falcon dove in a Moretti cage," he slurred, a leering grin on his face. "She has fire. I wonder if she's as spirited in the dark." The room went dead silent. Utensils clattered against plates. Every eye darted to Dante. He didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed his fork down with a soft, deliberate click that echoed like a gunshot. A terrifying coldness radiated from him, dropping the temperature of the room by 20 degrees. "Johnny," Dante said, his voice a silken threat. "Look at me." Johnny's bravado evaporated, replaced by a clammy primal fear. He slowly raised his gaze to meet the Don's. "The next time your eyes or your words disrespect what is mine," Dante continued, his voice lethally soft, "I will have Luca carve them out of your skull. Is that understood?" Johnny nodded, pale and shaking. See Don Moretti later that night. The residual tension followed them to the balcony overlooking the sea. The adrenaline of the confrontation still hummed in the air between them. Ilara's heart was still racing. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice unsteady. He turned to her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "Yes," he said, stepping closer until he crowded her against the cool marble railing. "I did." He lifted a hand, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. "No one touches what belongs to me. No one even looks." The proximity, the danger, the possessive fire in his eyes. It was a potent, intoxicating cocktail. Before she could think, before she could resist, he lowered his head and his lips claimed hers. It wasn't gentle. It was a desperate, hungry kiss, a clash of wills and a surrender to the forbidden current that had been pulling them together from the very beginning. It was the spark igniting the fuse. Marco's ambition was a cancer, and Dante's affection for Ilara was the catalyst for its metastasis. He saw not a truce but a weakness, a chink in the impenetrable armor of the Shadow King. He began his campaign of whispers, planting seeds of doubt among the older, more traditional capos. "He grows soft," he'd murmur over a glass of grappa. "This Falcone girl has bewitched him. He puts her before the family." His words were poison, delivered with a sympathetic smile. To accelerate his plan, he orchestrated a disaster. A crucial shipment of weapons, a deal Dante had personally overseen, was hijacked in a bloody ambush. It was Marco's own men who hit the convoy, but he made it look like the work of the Orellana syndicate, stoking the embers of an old rivalry. Dante was furious, his authority publicly challenged. Ilara, with her innate ability to read the currents of emotion that others missed, sensed the falseness in Marco's condolences. She saw the flicker of triumph in his eyes when he delivered the bad news, the subtle satisfaction that coiled beneath his feigned loyalty. She tried to warn Dante. "Marco isn't what he seems," she told him one night, her voice urgent. "He enjoys your struggle. Be careful." Dante, however, was a man bound by the sacred laws of omerta and blood. Marco was his cousin, his consigliere, the man who had stood by him for years. To suspect him was to suspect his own judgment, to admit a rot within his own house. "You are a Falcone," he said, his voice harsher than he intended, the old suspicions rearing their head. "You see enemies everywhere. Marco is family." The words created a chasm between them. He had chosen the code over her intuition, and in doing so, had unknowingly armed the traitor standing right beside him. The trap needed bait, and Alara was the perfect lure. Marco knew Dante had softened the strictures of her confinement, occasionally allowing her chaperone visits to a small bakery in the old city known for its cannoli, a small taste of a normal life she craved. It was a predictable pattern, and predictability was a vulnerability Marco was an expert at exploiting. He leaked the information to a crew of his most ruthless enforcers, men whose loyalty was to coin, not to the Moretti name. He gave them simple instructions: make it look like a botched kidnapping by Falcone loyalists. Frighten her, mark her, but do not kill her. Her terror was more valuable than her death. As Alara and her 2 guards strolled through the market, the vibrant chaos of vendors and shoppers a welcome distraction, the attack came without warning. They were pulled into a narrow, grimy alley. Her guards, Dante's men, fought valiantly but were quickly overwhelmed. A rough hand clamped over Alara's mouth, another grabbing her arm in a brutal grip. She fought back, kicking and scratching, her defiance a blaze of fury. "Your Falcone brothers have come for you, little dove," one of the men snarled, his breath foul. He shoved her against the brick wall, the impact jarring her teeth. As he twisted her arm, a flash of silver fell from his pocket, clattering unnoticed onto the grimy cobblestones. A custom Zippo lighter, engraved with a coiled serpent. They left her there, bruised and terrified, her silk blouse torn at the shoulder, the ugly purple mark of a handprint already blooming on her wrist. The physical pain was nothing compared to the chilling realization that her cage, which she had grown to see as a strange sort of sanctuary, was just as dangerous as the world outside. Marco's plan had worked perfectly. He had wounded Dante's pride and simultaneously framed the very family Alara represented, pushing the 2 syndicates to the brink of an unwinnable war. Dante found her in the infirmary of the villa, the sterile white room a stark contrast to the violence inflicted upon her. A doctor was tending to the bruises on her wrist. She sat on the edge of the examination table, small and fragile under the harsh fluorescent lights, but her eyes held a defiant fire that even terror couldn't extinguish. Dante stopped in the doorway, his loyal second-in-command Luca just behind him. The sight of her, the torn silk, the dark mark on her pale skin, the tremor in her hand she was trying so desperately to hide, broke something inside him. The carefully constructed dam of control he had maintained his entire adult life shattered into a million pieces. A primal, possessive rage, black and absolute, surged through him. It was an earthquake that shook the very foundations of his soul. He strode into the room, his presence sucking all the air out. The doctor flinched back. Alara looked up at him, and in his eyes, she saw a storm of pure, unadulterated fury she had never witnessed before. This was not the cold, calculating dawn. This was the Shadow King unleashed. His voice when it came was not a shout, but a low guttural thunder that vibrated through the floor, a promise of biblical retribution. He turned his head slightly, his gaze locking with Luca's. "Who?" he began, each word laced with deadly intent. "The fuck?" he growled, his knuckles white as he clenched his fists. "Laid hands on my girl?" It wasn't a question. It was a death sentence. The hunt began. Dante's vengeance was not a quiet affair. It was a symphony of brutality that echoed through the city's underworld. Men were dragged from their homes, from bars, from their beds. The Moretti machine, fueled by the personal rage of its dawn, moved with terrifying efficiency. At first, all signs pointed to the Falcones. An anonymous tip, planted by Marco, led Dante's men to a known Falcone safehouse where scraps of information about Alara's market trips were found. The deception was masterful, or seemed inevitable. Dante was on the verge of declaring it, of razing the Falcone empire to the ground in her name. But as he sat with Alara in the quiet of the rose garden, her hand now bandaged. He saw the doubt in her eyes. "It doesn't feel right," she whispered, staring at the blood-red petals. "The man who grabbed me. He said my Falcone brothers had come for me. My family would never call themselves that. It's too theatrical." Her emotional insight, the very thing he had once dismissed, now held his complete attention. "What else?" he pressed, his voice urgent. She closed her eyes, replaying the terrifying moments in the alley. His accent was wrong. More northern. And something else. Tattoo on his hand. A coiled serpent. "I've never seen that mark on any of my father's men." The serpent. The detail snagged in Dante's memory. It wasn't a Falcone symbol. It was the personal crest of a small vicious crew of mercenaries known for their loyalty to the highest bidder. And their leader was a man who frequently played cards with Marco. The final piece clicked into place when Luca, having meticulously swept the crime scene long after the city police had left, brought him a small tarnished object. A silver Zippo lighter, engraved with a coiled serpent. Dante stared at it. He had gifted that lighter to Marco's most trusted enforcer on his last birthday. The betrayal was absolute. A clean, sharp stab straight through the heart. It wasn't an outside enemy. The snake was in his own garden. The confrontation was not in a dungeon or an alley. It was in the same mahogany-paneled office where Dante had first laid claim to Alara. The wheel of fate had come full circle. Marco stood before the desk, a smug confidence radiating from him. He believed Dante had taken the bait, that war with the Falcones was imminent, and that in the ensuing chaos, the Capos would turn to him, the steady hand, to lead them. "The Falcones are mobilizing," Marco said, his voice laced with false concern. "We must strike first, Dante." A show of absolute force. Dante didn't respond. He simply leaned back in his leather chair and slid the silver Zippo lighter across the polished surface of the desk. It spun to a stop directly in front of Marco. The color drained from Marco's face. The smugness vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic. "An interesting trinket," Dante said, his voice dangerously calm. "Found in the same alley where Alara was attacked. Along with a man who had a matching tattoo and a northern accent. A man who, I'm told, is very loyal to you." Marco's composure cracked. "It's a frame. The Falcones are more cunning than we thought." But the lie was weak, pathetic. Dante rose slowly, the full, terrifying weight of his power settling over the room. "You disrespected my honor. You threatened my family. But your fatal mistake," he said, rounding the desk until he was inches from his cousin, "was that you laid hands on my woman." Marco sneered, his fear turning to arrogant defiance. "That whore has made you weak. The family sees it. They will follow me." "No, cousin," Dante whispered, a chilling finality in his tone as Luca and two other guards stepped out from the shadows, their purpose absolute. They won't. Justice in their world was swift, brutal, and final. Marco's treachery was exposed, and his fate served as a stark reminder of the price of disloyalty. The old rules had been broken, but not by the traitor. They had been rewritten by the king. The bloody aftermath settled into a new kind of peace, one forged not just by fear, but by a fierce, undeniable loyalty. Dante Moretti, the Shadow King, had shown his world that his heart was his greatest strength, and the woman who held it was more sacred than any code or territory. The whispers of him going soft died, replaced by a new legend. A Don who would burn the world down for his queen. He found her where he always found her, in the rose garden, now theirs. The setting sun bathed them in a golden light, a stark contrast to the shadows they had navigated to find each other. He came to her not as a captor, but as a man stripped of his armor, his heart exposed. He held out his hand, and in his palm lay not a diamond but a simple iron key. "The front gate," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer hid. "You are not my prisoner, Alara. You never were. You are my home." She looked from the key to his eyes, which held the promise of a future she never thought possible. She didn't take the key. Instead, she stepped into his embrace, her hands framing his face, her touch a balm on his scarred soul. "My home is here," she whispered. "With you." He bent his head and kissed her. A kiss not of fire and desperation, but of profound redemptive love. A love that had been tested by betrayal and sanctified by vengeance. And so the question is answered. A mafia boss's heart can indeed survive true love. It can be shattered, remade, and forged in the fires of devotion into something stronger and more dangerous than any weapon ever conceived. What do you think? Can a love born from such darkness truly last? Tell me your favorite epic romance story in the comments below. And don't forget to share this with someone who believes in the power of a love that rewrites all the rules.